teen boy helps old man rebuild his workshop. Months later, a millionaire changes his life forever. Dawn broke over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the aging buildings of Oak Street. Devon Williams, a 17-year-old black teenager, was running his usual paper route when he spotted something that made his heart stop. There, perched precariously on a rickety ladder behind an old Victorian house, was Mr. Anderson, the neighborhood's retired master carpenter. The elderly man swayed dangerously as he struggled with rotting wood from his workshop's roof. Time seemed to slow as the ladder wobbled, and Mr. Anderson's foot slipped. In that split second, Devon's world narrowed to a single choice that would change both their lives forever. Hey there! If you're enjoying this heartwarming story, take a quick second to hit that like button and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Every connection matters. Devon Williams wasn't born into carpentry, he inherited it through tragedy. His father, Marcus Williams, had been one of Philadelphia's most respected craftsmen, known for turning raw wood into pieces that belonged in museums rather than living rooms. The Williams basement workshop had been Devon's first playground, where the scent of sawdust mixed with his father's quiet humming created the soundtrack of his childhood. Marcus always said his hands could read wood like others read books, feeling the stories in each grain. "Wood never lies, son," he'd tell Devon while guiding his small hands along a piece of oak. "It tells you exactly what it wants to become. Our job is just to listen." Those moments, with sawdust dancing in streams of basement light, were sacred in Devon's memory. The accident happened on a Tuesday. Marcus was working on a restoration project at the city's historic courthouse when a scaffolding collapse sent him plummeting 4 stories. The official report cited equipment failure. But Devon's mother, Sarah, discovered it was negligence, cheaper materials, skipped safety checks, corners cut to save money. The settlement they received barely covered the funeral costs. Sarah Williams refused to let her son's future die with his father. She took on 3 jobs: morning shifts at the hospital cafeteria, afternoon cleaning at office buildings, and weekend work at a 24-hour diner. Devon would sometimes find her asleep in her uniform, grocery receipts and unpaid bills scattered across their kitchen table. Her hands, once soft and gentle, grew callous from constant work. "Your daddy had dreams for you," she'd say whenever Devon offered to drop out and work full-time. "But he wanted you to choose them, not have them chosen for you," so Devon stayed in school, excelled in woodshop class, and ran his paper route 7 days a week. The route didn't pay much, but it helped keep the lights on and food in their refrigerator. His father's tools remained untouched in the basement, gathering dust like museum pieces. Devon would sometimes sneak down there late at night, running his fingers over the worn handles, trying to feel what his father felt. The local technical college had a renowned carpentry program, but the tuition might as well have been $1 million. Besides, as his guidance counselor not so subtly suggested, people like you might want to consider more practical careers. Devon kept his dreams of woodworking quiet, like a secret shame. He watched YouTube videos about joinery techniques when he should have been studying calculus. He sketched furniture designs in the margins of his notebooks, imagining pieces that combined his father's traditional techniques with contemporary styles. But dreams didn't pay bills, and in their neighborhood, being young and black meant you needed a sensible plan, something safe, something steady. The only person who knew about Devon's hidden passion was his best friend, Lisa Chen, whose parents owned the corner grocery store. "You're just like your dad," she'd say, looking at his sketches during lunch break. "You see things that aren't there yet." Devon would smile and change the subject, but her words echoed his father's. "Wood tells you what it wants to become." Each morning on his paper route, Devon passed by old workshops and furniture stores being converted into coffee shops and boutiques. The neighborhood was changing, and not in ways that favored people who worked with their hands. Craftsmanship was becoming a luxury, and luxuries weren't meant for kids from his side of town. Yet every time he touched wood, helping with stage sets for the school play, fixing a broken chair for Mrs. Chen, or just running his hands along his father's workbench, Devon felt that same connection his father had talked about. It was like the wood was waiting, patient and eternal, for someone who could hear its stories and help them take shape. For now, though, those stories would have to wait, buried beneath the weight of reality and responsibility, like his father's tools in their basement tomb. Thomas Anderson's workshop on Oak Street stood like a time capsule from a different America. For 50 years, it had been the heart of Millbrook's craftsmanship community, where raw lumber transformed into heirlooms and apprentices became masters. Now, its weathered walls held memories thicker than the dust coating its windows, each scratch and dent telling stories of glory days long past. In his prime, Mr. Anderson had been more than just a carpenter. He was an artist who worked in wood. His pieces graced governors' mansions and cathedral altars, each bearing his distinctive signature, a small carved oak leaf, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. Every piece deserves its mark, he'd say, because every piece carries a part of its maker's soul. The loss of his only son, Michael, in Afghanistan 13 years ago had marked a turning point. Michael had been meant to inherit the workshop, to carry on the Anderson legacy of craftsmanship. Instead, his name became another gold star in a window, another folded flag in a display case. The funeral was attended by half the town, but afterward the silence in the workshop grew deafening. Sarah Anderson, his wife of 40 years, couldn't bear the emptiness. She passed away quietly in her sleep 2 years after Michael, leaving Thomas alone with his tools and memories. The workshop, once alive with the sound of saws and hammers, fell into a haunted quiet. He still worked, but his pieces lost their spark. Customers dwindled as cheaper, mass-produced furniture flooded the market. The workshop's decay mirrored his own. His hands, once steady enough to carve intricate rose patterns, now trembled with age. His eyes, which could once spot the slightest imperfection in a grain pattern, needed thick glasses. The stairs to his second-floor apartment grew steeper each year, and the workshop's maintenance became an overwhelming burden. Yet Thomas Anderson refused to leave. The property developers circling the neighborhood like vultures had made offers, good ones, with enough zeros to fund a comfortable retirement. But the workshop was more than property to him. It was where he'd taught Michael to sand his first board, where he'd crafted his wife's hope chest, where generations of neighborhood kids had learned that creating something with their hands could change how they saw themselves. Most precious was his private collection pieces he'd made for special occasions, each telling a story. The cradle he'd crafted for Michael, the altar for the local church, and his masterpiece, a dining set he'd made for James Maxwell SR, back when they'd served together in Vietnam. Maxwell had saved his life in the jungle, and that furniture set was Anderson's way of saying what words couldn't. He hadn't seen Maxwell in years, but heard he'd become some kind of millionaire investor. The neighborhood changed around him. Old families moved out, replaced by young professionals who saw his workshop as a quaint relic. The hardware store where he'd bought supplies for decades became a yoga studio. His apprentices aged out or moved on, leaving him as the last guardian of techniques passed down through generations. Each morning he'd climb that rickety ladder to patch another leak, fix another loose board, knowing it was a losing battle against time. His savings dwindled with each repair, but he couldn't bear to see his life's work crumble. The workshop wasn't just a building, it was his last connection to Michael, to Sarah, to the man he used to be. The only bright spot was watching young Devon Williams run his paper route each morning. Something about the boy reminded him of Michael, the same quiet determination, the same hidden spark. He'd seen Devon lingering sometimes, studying the workshop with an intensity that spoke of more than casual interest. But in today's world, what future was there for another craftsman? The thought haunted Anderson as he climbed that ladder one more time, unaware that fate was about to answer that question in ways he could never have imagined. The morning calm shattered with the wail of police sirens. Officer Brady's patrol car screeched to a halt in front of Mr. Anderson's workshop, responding to Mrs. Whitaker's suspicious person call. Through her lace curtains, the elderly neighbor had seen only what she wanted to see: a young black man menacing a vulnerable senior citizen. "Step away from him, hands where I can see them," Officer Brady's command cut through the morning air. Devon's stomach dropped as he slowly raised his hands, the ghost of his father's warnings echoing in his mind. Mr. Anderson, still catching his breath from his near fall, stepped forward with surprising agility. "What in God's name are you doing?" Mr. Anderson's voice carried the authority of his 70 years. "This young man just saved my life." His weathered hand gripped Devon's shoulder protectively, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the gathering crowd of neighbors. Mrs. Whitaker emerged from her house, clutching her robe closed at her throat, her face a mix of confusion and embedded prejudice. "I saw him running at Mr. Anderson," she insisted, her voice quavering. With all the break-ins lately, she trailed off, the weight of her assumptions hanging in the air. More neighbors appeared on their porches, smartphones recording the scene, their morning entertainment unfolding live. Officer Brady lowered his weapon but kept his hand near it. "Ma, are you sure about what you saw?" His training on community relations warred with ingrained biases. Devon remained still, his heart hammering against his ribs, aware that one wrong move could turn this misunderstanding tragic. "I know exactly what I saw." Mr. Anderson's voice cut through the tension like a saw through pine. "I was up on that ladder fixing my roof like the stubborn old fool I am. The ladder gave way, and if Devon hadn't been here—" He gestured at the splintered ladder. "Well, you'd be investigating something far worse than your imagined break-in." Lisa Chin, watching from her family's store across the street, had already started a live stream. "This is what we deal with." Her voice carried over the crowd. "A black kid can't even help someone without being treated like a criminal." The comment section exploded with reactions, the incident rapidly becoming another chapter in America's ongoing conversation about race. Devon finally found his voice. "Sir," he addressed Officer Brady, keeping his tone steady despite the anger burning in his chest. "I deliver Mr. Anderson's paper every morning. I saw him fall and just reacted." The paper route bag lay forgotten on the sidewalk, today's headlines ironically featuring a story about community policing reforms. Officer Brady had the decency to look uncomfortable. "We have to respond to all calls," he said, but the justification sounded hollow even to his own ears. Mr. Anderson wasn't having it. "Respond to what?" "Your own prejudices." The old carpenter's voice carried the weight of decades watching similar scenes play out. "This boy has more character in his little finger than half this neighborhood combined. While everyone else was behind their curtains, he was out here saving lives." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, Mrs. Whitaker's face flushing red as she retreated into her house. The morning sun climbed higher, highlighting the absurdity of the scene: a teenager with his hand still half raised, an elderly carpenter trembling with righteous anger, and a police officer caught between duty and decency. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding," Officer Brady finally offered, but the words fell flat in the morning air. The damage was done, another small crack in the foundation of trust between community and law enforcement. As the crowd dispersed and the patrol car pulled away, Devon's hand slowly lowered. The adrenaline drained from his system, leaving him feeling hollow. Mr. Anderson's grip on his shoulder tightened. "Come on, son," the old carpenter said quietly. "That roof still needs fixing, and I could use a young man's help. That is, if you're willing to risk being seen with a crazy old white man." The attempt at humor carried an edge of bitterness at what they'd just experienced. Devon managed a weak smile, but his eyes remained serious. "Yes, sir. Just let me get a better ladder first." Neither mentioned how their morning had become another viral moment, another hashtag in the making. Instead, they turned their attention to the workshop's roof, where honest work waited to bridge the divisions that humans created. The certified letter arrived 3 days after the ladder incident, its official letterhead bearing the Maxwell Development Corporation logo. Mr. Anderson's hands trembled as he read it, his face growing paler with each line. Devon, who had started spending his afternoons at the workshop, watched the old man sink heavily into his worn leather chair. "They're taking it all," Mr. Anderson whispered, the paper crinkling in his grip. "Eminent domain, they're calling it. Urban renewal project." His voice carried the hollow tone of a man watching his world crumble. The letter detailed plans for the Maxwell Plaza, a modern retail and luxury apartment complex that would revitalize the historic district. The mastermind behind the project was James Maxwell Jr., son of the same James Maxwell Sr., who'd once commissioned Mr. Anderson's finest work. The younger Maxwell had built his reputation by transforming underutilized neighborhoods into upscale developments, earning himself the nickname the gentrification king in business circles. That evening, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up outside the workshop. James Maxwell Jr. stepped out, his tailored suit worth more than 3 months of Devon's paper route earnings. His smile carried all the warmth of a corporate boardroom as he surveyed the property. Mr. Anderson Maxwell's voice oozed practice charm. "I hoped we could discuss this transition face to face. My father always spoke highly of your craftsmanship." He emphasized the last word like it was a quaint relic, something to be displayed in a museum rather than preserved as a living art. Devon, sweeping sawdust in the corner, watched the exchange through narrowed eyes. He recognized the predatory stance, the same look he'd seen when developers bought out Lisa's neighbors, forcing her family's store to compete with chain supermarkets. "Your father was a good man," Mr. Anderson replied, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. "He understood the value of things that can't be measured in dollars." The unspoken comparison hung in the air between them. Maxwell's smile tightened. "Times change, Mr. Anderson. This neighborhood needs updating. Progress is inevitable." His eyes swept over the workshop's worn equipment, the decades of accumulated tools and memories. "We're prepared to offer you fair market value, plus a relocation stipend. It's more than generous." "And what about the community?" Devon couldn't help himself. "The kids who come here to learn?" "The families who can't afford your luxury apartments." Maxwell turned, noticing him for the first time, his expression flickering between surprise and dismissal. "Ah, you must be the young man from the incident this morning. Social media has been quite buzzing about it." Maxwell's tone carried a veiled threat. "Such unfortunate misunderstandings can really impact property values, all the more reason for renewal." Mr. Anderson stood straighter, his craftsman's pride visible in his stance. "This workshop was here before you were born, Mr. Maxwell. Your father understood what it meant to the community. He didn't just buy furniture here, he learned the value of creating something lasting." "Sentiment doesn't pay property taxes," Maxwell countered smoothly. "You have 30 days to consider our offer." After that, well, he left the threat unfinished, turning to leave. At the door, he paused. "Oh, and Mr. Anderson? That dining set I inherited from Father, I'm having it replaced. Modern pieces better suit my aesthetic." After Maxwell left, the workshop felt smaller, older. Devon watched Mr. Anderson run his hand along a workbench, his fingers tracing decades of nicks and scratches. "Your father would have understood," the old man said quietly. "He knew that some things are worth more than money." Devon picked up the notice again, his mind racing. Between the legal terms and corporate letterhead, he spotted something odd: discrepancies in the zoning citations, irregularities in the documentation. His mother's voice echoed in his memory, talking about the shortcuts and negligence that had cost his father's life. "Mr. Anderson," Devon said slowly, "what if this isn't about progress at all? What if there's something else going on here?" The old carpenter looked up, seeing the spark of determination in the young man's eyes, the same spark he'd seen in another young man, decades ago, in a jungle far from home. The workshop's dust motes danced in the fading sunlight, witnesses to the beginning of a battle neither of them had expected to fight. But sometimes, Devon was learning, the most important fights found you rather than the other way around. Devon deserves a quick like for his courage and kindness, but unfortunately he hasn't gotten one yet. Let's change that. Hit that like button to support this young hero's journey. The days following Maxwell's visit transformed the workshop into a sanctuary of shared purpose. Each afternoon after his paper route in school, Devon would slip into the warmth of the workshop, where Mr. Anderson waited with patience and wisdom earned through decades of craftsmanship. "The wood grain is like a map," Mr. Anderson explained, guiding Devon's hands along a piece of oak. "Each line tells you where to go, how to work with it instead of against it." The lessons went beyond mere technique. They were meditations on life itself, passed down through generations of craftsmen. The neighborhood watched this unlikely partnership with evolving perspectives. Mrs. Whitaker, still embarrassed by the police incident, began leaving fresh-baked cookies on the workshop's doorstep. Officer Brady would slow his patrol car, watching Devon masterfully handle a plane or chisel, his previous prejudice gradually eroding with each display of skill. Their first project together was restoring an antique rocking chair for the local church. Devon's young eyes spotted details Mr. Anderson's aging vision missed, while the old craftsman's experienced hands guided them through complex joinery techniques. When the pastor came to collect it, tears welled in his eyes at the perfect restoration. "This is more than craftsmanship," he said. "This is heritage preserved." Word spread through the community. People began stopping by with small repairs: a broken chair leg, a damaged picture frame, a family heirloom needing care. Each project became a lesson, with Mr. Anderson teaching not just woodworking, but the value of patience, precision, and pride in one's work. "Your father had these same instincts," Mr. Anderson said one evening, watching Devon sand a table with perfect attention to detail. He could feel the wood story. The comment hung in the air like sawdust in sunlight, a bridge between past and present. Lisa started bringing her homework to the workshop, documenting their progress for her social media channels. "You're changing the narrative," she told Devon, showing him comments from around the world. "People see something special happening here." The videos of their work, of this black teenager and elderly white craftsman working in harmony, attracted thousands of views. The transformation wasn't just in public perception. Devon's grades improved as woodworking concepts helped him understand geometry and physics. His mother noticed him standing taller, speaking with quiet confidence. The workshop became his refuge from the world's chaos, a place where creation trumped destruction. Mr. Anderson found himself revitalized by Devon's presence. His hand seemed steadier, his step lighter. He began sharing stories he hadn't told in years about learning the trade from his own father, about teaching Michael, about the pieces that had marked milestones in his life. The workshop's silence gave way to a symphony of work sounds punctuated by laughter and conversation. One Saturday, they collaborated on a particularly challenging piece, a music stand for the high school orchestra. Devon suggested incorporating modern design elements while maintaining traditional joinery techniques. The result was stunning, a perfect blend of old and new, much like their partnership. Sometimes, Mr. Anderson reflected, watching Devon apply the final coat of finish, "The strongest things we build aren't made of wood at all." The comment reached beyond their work to touch something deeper, the bonds of trust and understanding they'd forged through shared purpose. The workshop itself seemed to respond to their energy. The dusty corners grew cleaner, the tools found proper homes, and the space hummed with renewed purpose. Even the morning light seemed brighter, filtering through newly cleaned windows to illuminate their work. But amid this renaissance, shadows loomed. Maxwell Development's deadline crept closer, and more corporate CFEs began cruising past the workshop, their tinted windows hiding calculating eyes. Each passing day brought more certified letters, each more threatening than the last. Yet, in the workshop, Devon and Mr. Anderson continued their work, each project a quiet act of defiance against those who would reduce their craft to mere square footage and profit margins. They were building more than furniture, they were preserving a legacy, one piece at a time. "You know they'll try to stop us," Devon said one evening, carefully putting away his tools. Mr. Anderson nodded, his eyes on the workshop's worn wooden floors. "Some things are worth fighting for, son. Your father knew that. I suspect you do too." The evening light caught the sawdust in the air, turning it to floating gold, a silent witness to the strength of bonds forged through shared purpose and mutual respect. The discovery came while cleaning the workshop's dusty attic. Devon was organizing old receipts when a leather-bound album slipped from a high shelf, spilling black and white photographs across the wooden floor. Among them, a faded image caught his eye, two young soldiers in Vietnam, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning despite the mud and exhaustion etched on their faces. "Mr. Anderson," Devon called, his voice quiet with revelation. Is this you and Mr. Maxwell?" The old carpenter crossed the room slowly, taking the photograph with trembling hands. His eyes misted over as decades of memories rushed back. "James Maxwell, S.R., and I served in the same unit," he began, settling into his favorite chair. "We were just boys then, scared out of our minds in a jungle halfway around the world." His finger traced the image gently. "Your father's name was Marcus, wasn't it? Named after James's brother who didn't make it back." Devon sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounding himself with scattered photographs. Each image revealed another layer of connection, Mr. Anderson and James S.R. At a workshop opening, at family barbecues, at christenings. Their families had been intertwined long before Devon was born. The dining set in James's study wasn't just furniture, Mr. Anderson continued, pulling out more photos. It was a promise fulfilled. "In the jungle, during a particularly bad firefight, James saved my life. Took a bullet in the shoulder that was meant for me. I swore if we made it home, I'd create something worthy of that sacrifice." The photographs told the story, Mr. Anderson spending months selecting the perfect woods, crafting each piece with extraordinary care. The final product was a masterpiece, a dining set that combined classical elegance with subtle details that spoke to their shared experiences. In one photo, James S.R. ran his hands over the table's surface, his expression one of profound understanding. But something changed. Mr. Anderson's voice grew heavy. James got into real estate, started building his empire. We stayed close at first, but success has a way of changing people. Or maybe it just reveals who they truly are. He gestured around the workshop. He chose a different path, building with contracts and dollars instead of wood and nails. Davon found another photo that made his breath catch. His father, much younger, standing proudly in the workshop. "Dad worked here?" he asked, though he already knew the answer was more complex than a simple yes or no. Marcus was special. Mr. Anderson smiled. "Like you, he could read the wood story. James sponsored his apprenticeship here, said it was repaying an old debt to the community. Your father became one of the finest craftsmen I've ever known." The pieces were falling into place. Devon's father hadn't just been another carpenter, he'd been part of a legacy, a connection between families that spanned generations. The weight of this history settled around his shoulders like a warm cloak. When Marcus died, Mr. Anderson's voice cracked slightly. James was devastated. He tried to help your family, but pride and grief have a way of building walls. Now his son wants to tear down everything we built, not understanding what it really means. Devon picked up another photo, a grand opening ribbon-cutting ceremony. Behind the smiling faces, he could see the workshop, proud and new. "Does James Jr. know any of this history?" Mr. Anderson shook his head sadly. James Sr. raised him on business principles, not memories. The boy grew up learning about profit margins instead of grain patterns. Now he sees this place as just another property to develop, not realizing he's trying to erase his own father's legacy along with mine. As the sun set, casting long shadows through the workshop windows, Davon carefully gathered the photographs. Each image was a thread in a tapestry of relationships, sacrifices, and shared dreams that had shaped not just families, but an entire community. "Mr. Anderson," Davon said finally, "these stories, this history, it's too important to lose. There has to be a way to make James Jr. understand what he's really destroying." The old carpenter nodded slowly, his eyes on the fading light outside. Perhaps he mused, but some people can only understand value when they're about to lose something priceless. He didn't know how prophetic those words would prove to be. The pressure from Maxwell Development mounted like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Each week brought new complications: building code violation notices, surprise inspections, and increasingly aggressive offers to buy the property. Davon began documenting everything, his phone filled with photos of each violation and recordings of every interaction. The workshop's regular customers started receiving letters suggesting that their antique restorations might not meet modern safety standards. Mrs. Chen found her grocery store's permit suddenly under review. Even Lisa's social media posts about the workshop attracted mysterious complaints and shadow bans. "They're trying to strangle us slowly," Devon observed one afternoon, watching another inspector take photographs of the workshop's exterior. Mr. Anderson merely nodded, his weathered hand steady as he worked on a delicate inlay pattern. The situation reached a critical point when Devon discovered a disturbing pattern in the building inspection reports. Hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic language was evidence of falsified data and manipulated safety assessments. The same tactics that had contributed to his father's death were being employed again, this time to destroy rather than build. "Look at these dates," Devon showed Mr. Anderson, spreading documents across the workbench. The inspection times overlap. The same inspector supposedly checked 3 different buildings simultaneously. His fingers traced through highlighted inconsistencies. And these violations, they're citing codes that don't even exist. Mr. Anderson studied the papers through his thick glasses, his expression darkening. "This goes beyond just wanting the property," he muttered. "They're trying to erase any evidence that we were ever here." The workshop's legal troubles coincided with a life-changing letter from Stanford University. Devon had been awarded a full scholarship to their prestigious architectural program, a dream come true that now felt like a cruel joke. The acceptance deadline loomed just weeks before the workshop's scheduled demolition hearing. "You have to take it," Mr. Anderson insisted when Devon showed him the letter. "This is exactly what your father would have wanted for you," but they both knew it wasn't that simple. Accepting meant leaving just when the fight for the workshop was reaching its climax. Devon's mother was torn between pride and practicality. "Baby, this is your future," she said over their meager dinner. "Your father wanted you to have opportunities he never had." Her eyes shone with unshed tears. "But he also taught you to stand up for what's right." The pressure affected everyone differently. Lisa's family faced increasing scrutiny from health inspectors, their store's future hanging by a thread. Officer Brady, who had become an unlikely ally, found himself reassigned to a different beat. Even Mrs. Whitaker received a letter suggesting her home's historic status might need reevaluation. One evening, while reviewing more documents, Devon found something that made his blood run cold. Hidden in the development plans were designs for luxury condos that far exceeded local height restrictions. The projected weight would put enormous pressure on the aging infrastructure beneath the historic district, the same kind of oversight that had led to his father's fatal accident. They're not just trying to change the neighborhood, Devon realized. They're setting up another disaster. The implications were staggering. If the development proceeded as planned, lives could be at risk. The discovery forced Devon to confront an impossible choice: accept the scholarship and secure his future, or stay and fight against what he now knew was more than just gentrification, it was potentially criminal negligence. Mr. Anderson watched the internal struggle play out in his young apprentice's eyes. Sometimes he said softly, "The most important things we build aren't made of wood or stone. They're built from the choices we make when everything is on the line." The workshop had never felt more like home than in those moments of crisis. Every tool, every scratch on the floor, every mote of dust dancing in the sunlight seemed to hold memories of craftsmen who had faced their own battles and made their own choices. Devon spent hours in his father's basement workshop, running his hands over the old tools, seeking guidance from the ghost of a man who had died trying to protect others from corporate negligence. The scholarship letter and the damning evidence sat side by side on the workbench, two futures pulling him in opposite directions. "What would you do, Dad?" he whispered to the empty basement. The tools offered no answer, but their presence reminded him of everything his father had stood for: integrity, craftsmanship, and the courage to stand up for what's right. The decision crystallized one morning as he watched Mr. Anderson teaching a neighborhood kid how to sand with the grain. The old carpenter's patience, the child's wonder, the simple beauty of knowledge passed down, it was everything Maxwell Development threatened to destroy. That evening, Devon made his choice. He wrote 2 letters, one to Stanford requesting a deferment, and another to the City Planning Commission detailing his findings. The workshop had taught him that some things were worth fighting for, even at the cost of personal dreams. "We're going to need help," he told Mr. Anderson the next morning. "Legal help, community support, media attention, everything we can get." The old carpenter smiled, recognition flickering in his eyes. He'd seen that same determination in another young man's face, decades ago in a distant jungle. As Devon dug deeper into the Maxwell Development scandal, the workshop became command central for their investigation. Lisa used her social media skills to connect with other communities that had faced similar battles. Mrs. Chen provided her store's back office for secret meetings. Even Mrs. Whitaker, transformed from suspicious neighbor to fierce ally, kept watch for suspicious vehicles. But the most surprising development came from an unexpected source. Late one evening, a sleek black Tesla pulled up outside the workshop. The woman who stepped out carried herself with corporate precision, but her eyes held a familiar warmth. "I'm Catherine Maxwell," she introduced herself, "James Jr.'s sister. And I think it's time someone told you the whole story." She placed a thick folder on the workbench, her manicured nails a stark contrast against the rough wood. Inside were documents that painted a troubling picture. James Maxwell, S.R., had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia 3 years ago. Rather than step down gracefully, he'd signed over control of the company to his son, trusting Junior to maintain his legacy. Instead, Junior had systematically dismantled his father's community-focused business model in favor of aggressive development. "Dad doesn't know," Catherine explained, her voice tight with emotion. "Junior keeps him isolated in a luxury retirement community, managing his calls, his visitors, even his mail. He has no idea what's happening to the neighborhoods he spent his life building up." Mr. Anderson absorbed this news with visible pain. James was more than a business partner, he revealed. "That night in Vietnam, when he took that bullet for me, he made me promise something. He said if anything ever happened to him, I'd look out for his children." Devon watched the old carpenter's hands tremble as he pulled out a worn envelope from his desk. Inside was a letter dated 20 years ago, written in James S.R.'s confident hand. It detailed his vision for the community's sustainable development, preservation of historic crafts, support for local businesses. Everything his son was now destroying. Junior resented the workshop. Catherine continued. Growing up, Dad was always here, learning woodworking from Mr. Anderson, talking about community values. Junior wanted him in the office, learning about hostile takeovers and profit margins. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Junior's vendetta against the workshop wasn't just about property values, it was personal. He was trying to erase every reminder of the father who had disappointed him, the values he had rejected. As they talked late into the night, more secrets emerged. Catherine revealed that their mother had left years ago, unable to watch her husband's obsession with community building destroy their family life. Junior had blamed his father's small-town mindset for driving her away. The dining set Mr. Anderson made Catherine smiled sadly. Mom used to say it was the most honest thing in our house. Everything else was for show, but that was real craftsmanship, real gratitude. Devon shared his own discoveries about the development plans, the safety violations, the potential risks. Catherine's face paled. Junior's cutting corners everywhere, she confirmed. He has investors breathing down his neck, demanding faster returns. He's gambling with people's lives. Mr. Anderson listened to it all, his expression growing heavier with each revelation. I failed them, he said finally. I promised James the first look out for his children, and look what's happened. But Devon saw it differently. You didn't fail, he insisted. You kept the promise in the most important way. You preserved the values he wanted to pass on. Maybe not in Junior, but he glanced at Catherine, who nodded in understanding. They worked through the night, Catherine providing insider information that connected their scattered evidence into a cohesive case. She knew which regulators were compromised, which officials might still be trustworthy, where the bodies were buried in Maxwell Development's books. As dawn approached, Catherine stood to leave. There's one more thing, she said, hesitating. Dad's been asking about the workshop. Even through the dementia, he remembers this place. He keeps talking about something hidden here, something important he left for safekeeping. Mr. Anderson's eyes widened with sudden recognition. The plans, he whispered. James's original plans for the neighborhood. He said he wanted them somewhere safe, somewhere his board couldn't find them. Devon felt a surge of hope. Those plans could be the key to everything, proof of the original vision, evidence of how far Junior had strayed, maybe even legal protection for the historic district. As Catherine's Tesla disappeared into the dawn, Devon and Mr. Anderson shared a look of renewed determination. They weren't just fighting for a workshop anymore. They were fighting for a friend's legacy, for a community's soul, for the kind of values that couldn't be measured in profit margins. We'll need to find those plans, Devon said, already thinking of where to look. Mr. Anderson nodded, his eyes on the first light touching the workshop's worn floors. And when we do, he added softly, we'll need to be ready for what comes next. Junior won't give up easily. The workshop seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next chapter in a story that had started decades ago in a distant jungle, where one man had saved another's life and set in motion a chain of events that would echo through generations. The public hearing at City Hall drew a crowd that spilled onto the streets. Television crews jostled for position as Devon and Mr. Anderson climbed the marble steps, Catherine Maxwell close behind. Lisa's live stream had already attracted thousands of viewers, her camera capturing the tension in every face. Inside, the council chamber hummed with nervous energy. James Maxwell Jr. sat with his legal team, his expression carefully neutral as he watched his sister take a seat with the opposition. The planning commission members shuffled their papers, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the packed room. Devon approached the podium first, his father's tool belt worn proudly over his best suit. The leather was cracked with age, but the tools still gleamed, maintained with the same care his father had taught him. This isn't just about saving a building, he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. It's about preserving the soul of our community. He presented their evidence methodically, like his father had taught him to approach any challenging project. Slide after slide showed falsified safety reports, doctored structural assessments, and the dangerous compromises in Maxwell Development's plans. The audience gasped at projected casualty statistics if the development proceeded as planned. The same negligence that killed my father, Devon's voice cracked slightly, is being built into every floor of this proposed development. How many more families will lose loved ones because profit margins matter more than human lives? James Jr. shifted uncomfortably as Devon revealed the overlapping inspection times, the non-existent building codes, the pattern of harassment against local businesses. Each accusation was backed by meticulous documentation, much of it bearing Maxwell Development's own letterhead. Catherine took the stand next, her corporate polish giving weight to her testimony. "My father built this company on the principle that development should serve the community, not destroy it," she stated, looking directly at her brother. "What's happening now isn't development, it's demolition of everything he stood for." The room fell silent as she described her father's condition, the isolation, the systematic dismantling of his life's work. Junior's face darkened with each word, his hands clenching beneath the table. Mr. Anderson's testimony cut the deepest. He didn't just talk about the workshop or the development plans. He spoke about James S.R., about Vietnam, about promises made in darkness and kept through decades. "A man's legacy isn't in the buildings he puts up," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years. "It's in the values he passes down." Then came their surprise witness. The back doors opened, and James Maxwell S.R. himself entered, supported by Mrs. Chin and Mrs. Whitaker. The old man moved slowly, but his eyes were clear as they swept the room, finally settling on his son. Junior half rose from his seat, shock breaking through his corporate mask. "Dad? You're supposed to be at the facility." "Supposed to be a lot of things, son," the elder Maxwell replied, his voice weakened but resolute. "Supposed to be a father who taught you the right values. Supposed to be a businessman who built communities, not fortunes. Supposed to be here to stop you from making the biggest mistake of your life." The room held its breath as father and son faced each other across the chamber. James S.R. reached into his jacket and withdrew a set of faded blueprints, the original plans Mr. Anderson had kept hidden all these years. "These plans," he said, spreading them carefully on the commission's table, "show what development can be when we put community first. Every detail, every decision was made to lift people up, not push them out." His hands trembled as he traced the lines. "This was my dream, son, and you've turned it into a nightmare." Junior's composure cracked. "You were never there," he burst out, years of resentment spilling over. "Always at that workshop, always talking about community, about craftsmanship. What about your own family? What about your son?" The elder Maxwell absorbed the outburst with visible pain. "I thought I was teaching you something precious," he replied softly. "Something worth more than money. But all you learned was how to tear things down." Devon watched the family drama unfold, seeing echoes of his own loss, his own father's legacy. The workshop had been more than a building to both families. It had been a testament to values that transcended generations, a bridge between past and future. The commission members pored over the original plans, comparing them to the current proposals. The differences were stark. Where James S.R. had planned community spaces, Junior had plotted luxury condos. Where the original design preserved historic structures, the new plans showed total demolition. As the evidence mounted, Junior's legal team began whispering urgently among themselves. The tide was turning and everyone in the room could feel it. But Devon knew better than to celebrate too early. The hardest battles often came just when victory seemed closest. The hearing's momentum suddenly shifted when Junior's lead attorney stood, wielding a folder of his own. While these historical reminiscences are touching, he began with practiced condescension. "Let's discuss the present. Specifically, Mr. Williams' deferred scholarship to Stanford." A murmur rippled through the chamber as the attorney projected an email onto the screen. "An anonymous source informs us that Mr. Williams' deferment was contingent on community service. How convenient that his crusade aligns perfectly with his academic requirements." Devon felt the blood drain from his face. He had mentioned the scholarship condition only once, in a private email to the admissions office. Someone had been monitoring his communications. Furthermore, the attorney continued, "Mr. Anderson's workshop has operated without proper certification for the past 5 years. Every piece produced there, including those for the local church, technically violates current safety regulations." Mr. Anderson's hand found Devon's shoulder, steadying him as the attorney launched into a detailed attack on their credibility. The workshop's finances were dissected, past customer complaints dredged up, every minor violation magnified into potential catastrophe. Junior rose, his composure regained. "I respect my father's legacy," he announced smoothly, "but sentiment can't stand in the way of progress." This isn't about memories, it's about safety, about the future. He gestured to his own set of experts, who presented a parade of worst-case scenarios about the workshop's structural integrity. Catherine tried to interject, but Junior's legal team was prepared. They presented documents suggesting she held a grudge over past inheritance disputes. Her insider testimony was painted as revenge, her evidence dismissed as hearsay. James S.R. watched his children's public destruction of each other with growing distress. The strain showed on his face as Junior systematically dismantled every argument for preservation, using lessons learned at his father's own company against the very values that had built it. Devon's mother, sitting quietly in the audience, suddenly stood. "My husband," she began, her voice trembling but clear, "died because people like you decided profit margins were more important than safety protocols. Now you're standing here, using the same tactics, threatening more families with the same heartbreak." Junior's expression flickered. For a moment, the polished corporate facade cracked, revealing something vulnerable beneath. But then his attorney whispered something, and the mask slipped back into place. "Mrs. Williams," he replied, "you of all people should understand the importance of modern safety standards. Standards that, frankly, this obsolete workshop cannot meet." The commission members shifted uncomfortably as the debate devolved into increasingly personal attacks. The community members who had come to support the workshop watched helplessly as their testimonies were undermined by legal technicalities and regulatory minutiae. Lisa's live-stream comments exploded with outrage, but in the chamber the legal machinery ground inexorably forward. The human story they had tried to tell was being buried under an avalanche of bureaucratic procedure. Then, from the back of the room, a new voice spoke up. "I have something to add." All heads turned to see Officer Brady, still in uniform, holding a thick envelope. "These past months I've been documenting every inspection, every anonymous complaint, every suspicious incident around the workshop." He approached the commission's table, including multiple instances of what appears to be orchestrated harassment. Junior's attorney started to object, but Brady continued. "As a law enforcement officer, I'm obligated to report potential criminal patterns, including apparent attempts to manipulate property values through selective enforcement and targeted intimidation." The chamber erupted in chaos. Junior's legal team huddled in urgent consultation while Catherine and James S.R. exchanged knowing looks. The commissioner called for order, but the damage was done. The careful legal construct Junior had built was beginning to unravel. Devon felt a strange calm settle over him. They had revealed the truth, brought everything into the light. Whatever happened next, they had fought with integrity, just as his father would have wanted. Mr. Anderson gripped his hand, weathered fingers strong despite their trembling. "Your father would be proud," he whispered, "no matter what happens next." The workshop's fate now hung in the balance, along with the futures of all those who had fought to save it. But as Devon looked around the chamber, at the community that had come together to defend something precious, he realized they had already won something more valuable than property rights. This story of courage and justice continues, but it's a journey we'd love to share with you. If you believe in stories that touch hearts and inspire change, join our family by subscribing. Together, we'll explore more powerful tales that remind us of what truly matters. The night after the hearing, Devon stayed late at the workshop, cataloging evidence for their legal team. Mr. Anderson had gone home hours earlier, urged by Catherine to rest after the emotional day. The autumn evening had brought an early darkness, broken only by the warm glow of the workshop's ancient lighting. The first sign of trouble came as a subtle shift in the air, an acrid smell that seemed out of place among the familiar scents of wood and varnish. Devon was deep in paperwork when he noticed smoke curling under the door from the workshop's storage area. His father's training kicked in instantly. Fire in a woodshop was every craftsman's nightmare. Devon reached for his phone just as the first flames became visible, licking at the edges of the doorframe. The workshop's old wood, saturated with decades of finishes and oils, caught quickly. The 911 call was brief. Fire at Anderson's workshop on Oak Street. Possible arson. He started toward the main entrance, but found it already blocked by flames that seemed too organized, too purposeful to be accidental. The fire had been started in multiple locations, creating a calculated trap. Devon's mind raced through his father's lessons about workshop safety. The back exit was through the storage room, now an inferno. The windows? Too small for escape. The smoke was thickening, making each breath a struggle. He pulled his shirt over his nose, dropping low as he'd been taught. Through the growing haze, he spotted Mr. Anderson's most precious pieces, the photo album of memories, James S. Ardot's original plans, irreplaceable templates passed down through generations. The heat was becoming unbearable, but Devon couldn't let these pieces of history burn. He worked quickly, gathering what he could into his father's old tool belt. The flames were spreading across the ceiling now, causing ancient beams to crack and groan. A portion of the roof collapsed near the entrance, sending up a shower of sparks and burning debris. The smoke was disorienting, making it hard to think. Devon found himself remembering his father's words in an emergency. "You've got seconds to make choices you'll live with forever." The workshop's treasures weighed heavy against his hip as he searched desperately for a way out. Through the windows, he could see emergency lights approaching, hear sirens in the distance. But the fire was moving faster than help could arrive. The workshop's interior was becoming a maze of flame and shadow, each breath more painful than the last. Then he heard it, someone pounding on the sidewall. Lisa's voice cut through the roar of the flames. "Devon." The crawl space. Under the workbench, she had remembered something he'd forgotten, the narrow maintenance access they'd used while repairing pipes last summer. The workbench was already beginning to smolder. Devon dropped to his hands and knees, choking on the thick smoke. The access panel was barely visible through the haze, its edges glowing with reflected flame. With the last of his strength, he pried open the panel. The space beyond was tight, designed for pipes, not people. But it was his only chance. Devon forced himself into the narrow opening, dragging the tool belt of treasures behind him. The crawl space became a nightmare of heat and claustrophobia. Every inch was a battle against panic, against the primal fear of being trapped. The sound of the fire above was deafening, like some hungry beast trying to break through. Finally, after what felt like eternity, Devon saw light ahead, clean, cool night air. Hands reached in, grabbing him, pulling him to safety. He emerged into chaos: fire trucks, flashing lights. The entire neighborhood gathered to watch the workshop burn. Mr. Anderson arrived just as Devon was being loaded into an ambulance. The old carpenter's face was ashen as he watched his life's work consumed by flames. But when he saw Devon was alive, saw the tool belt still clutched in his smoke-blackened hands, tears cut through the soot on his cheeks. The workshop, Devon tried to speak through the oxygen mask, but Mr. Anderson shook his head. "Buildings can be rebuilt," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "What you saved, the memories, the plans, are history. That's what matters. Those are the real treasures." As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, arson investigators found what Devon had already known: multiple points of origin, accelerants, blocked exits. This was no accident. This was no accident. This was a message written in flame and ash about what happened to those who stood against progress. News of the workshop fire spread through media channels like wildfire itself. Lisa's live stream of the incident went viral, showing Devon's dramatic rescue and the workshop's destruction in real time. Local news crews descended on Oak Street, their cameras capturing the still smoking ruins against the rising sun. Devon watched it all from his hospital bed, being treated for smoke inhalation and minor burns. His mother hadn't left his side, her hands constantly touching his arm, his face, reassuring herself that he was really there. The doctors wanted to keep him for observation, concerned about potential lung damage from the toxic smoke. "It wasn't just paint and wood burning in there," the lead physician explained. "Old workshops like that, they're full of chemicals, finishes, decades of accumulated materials. You're lucky to be alive." The words hung heavy in the sterile hospital air. Catherine Maxwell arrived shortly after dawn, her usual corporate polish disrupted by obvious distress. "Junior's gone," she announced without preamble. His apartment's cleaned out, his accounts emptied. He disappeared right after the hearing. Her implication was clear: her brother had orchestrated the fire, then fled to avoid consequences. The community's response was immediate and overwhelming. Mrs. Chen organized a fundraiser through her store. Mrs. Whitaker rallied the neighborhood association. Even Officer Brady, now officially investigating the arson, contributed by leaking evidence of Maxwell Development's involvement to trusted journalists. But the real surprise came from James Maxwell SR. Despite his declining health, he arrived at the hospital with his lawyers in tow. "This ends now," he declared, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "I'm taking back control of the company. The board can either accept it or face a full investigation into their complicity in Junior's actions." Mr. Anderson spent hours sitting silently by Devon's bedside, his weathered hands occasionally reaching out to touch the saved photo album, the rescued plans, as if confirming they were real. The old carpenter seemed to have aged years overnight, the loss of his workshop etched deeply in his face. "I should have been there," he said finally, his voice rough with guilt. "It should have been me in there, not you." Devon tried to speak, but his smoke-damaged throat made it difficult. Instead, he reached for his father's tool belt, still stained with soot but intact. From its pockets he pulled out not just documents and photos, but small treasures, the carved oak leaf that was Mr. Anderson's signature, template patterns passed down through generations, even the small book of measurements and notes that Michael had kept during his apprenticeship. Local craftsmen from across the state began arriving, drawn by the story of the workshop's destruction. They brought offers of tools, materials, workspace, anything to help preserve the legacy of Anderson's workshop. Many had their own stories about pieces of furniture that had connected generations, about the value of craftsmanship in an increasingly disposable world. The media coverage shifted from simple tragedy to something larger, a story about community, about the fight to preserve craftsmanship and values in the face of soulless development. Devon's rescue of the workshop's historical treasures became a powerful symbol of resistance against corporate greed. But amid the public outrage and support, Devon faced his own private struggles. Nightmares of fire and smoke jolted him awake. The doctors warned about possible long-term respiratory issues. His Stanford deferment was now complicated by medical concerns. Yet something else had emerged from the ashes, a clarity about his path forward. As he watched the community rally around Mr. Anderson, as he saw the impact one workshop had made on so many lives, Devon understood that his father's legacy and his own future were intertwined with something larger than himself. "We'll rebuild," he whispered through his oxygen mask, gripping Mr. Anderson's hand. "Something better than before. Something that can't burn." The old carpenter nodded, understanding in his eyes. They had lost a building, but the spirit of craftsmanship, the connections between generations, the values they fought for, these were fireproof. They lived in the hearts and hands of those who believed in creating something lasting. The truth emerged from an unexpected source 3 days after the fire. James Maxwell Jr., contrary to appearances, hadn't fled the country. He was found in his father's old study, surrounded by decades of company documents, in what appeared to be a complete mental breakdown. "I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt," he repeated to the officers who responded to Catherine's wellness check. "I just wanted him to see, to understand." Among the scattered papers were old photographs of a younger Junior at the workshop, trying desperately to master woodworking under his father's demanding gaze. The investigation revealed a more complex story than anyone had imagined. Junior's actions, while inexcusable, stemmed from years of feeling measured against an impossible standard. Every business success had been met with his father's stories about craftsmanship and community. Every profit margin was compared to the value of creating something lasting. "I found this in his personal files," Catherine told Devon at the hospital, holding up a newspaper clipping from 20 years ago. It showed a teenage Junior proudly displaying a simple wooden box he'd made at Anderson's workshop. The article praised James S.R.'s commitment to teaching his son traditional values. What it didn't show was the boy's crushed expression when his father pointed out every flaw in the workmanship. The arson investigation took an unexpected turn when security footage emerged from a neighboring building. The fire hadn't been set by Junior at all, but by 2 members of his development team acting on what they thought were implied orders. Junior's breakdown had been triggered by the realization that his corporate culture of results at any cost had led to potentially murderous consequences. More revelations followed. Among the documents Junior had been obsessively reviewing were records of his father's original vision for Maxwell Development. The company had been founded not just as a real estate venture, but as a partnership with craftsmen like Mr. Anderson, aimed at preserving traditional skills while developing communities sustainably. "Your father was part of it too," Catherine told Devon, showing him contracts bearing Marcus Williams' signature. He was supposed to head the vocational training program before she trailed off, but Devon understood. Before the accident that had claimed his father's life, there had been plans for something remarkable. Mr. Anderson confirmed the story from his hospital chair, where he'd continued his vigil by Devon's bedside. James had this dream, he explained, his voice heavy with memory. Development that didn't just build buildings, but built communities. Each project was supposed to include workshops, apprenticeship programs, spaces for craftsmen to work and teach. The most stunning discovery came from the workshop's rescued documents. Hidden within the original plans was a legally binding covenant. Any development in the historic district had to maintain spaces for traditional crafts and community education. The covenant had been buried by previous Maxwell development executives, but it had never been legally dissolved. This changes everything, Catherine's legal team confirmed. The current development plans aren't just ethically wrong, they're in violation of the company's founding documents. James S.R., visiting Devon's hospital room with the help of a nurse, seemed to gain strength as the truth emerged. Junior wasn't wrong about everything he admitted. I did push too hard, expect too much. I was so focused on preserving traditions that I forgot to preserve my relationship with my son. The media narrative shifted dramatically. The story of corporate greed became a story of generational expectations, lost connections, and the possibility of redemption. Junior's breakdown humanized him in ways his corporate success never had. Devon, listening to these revelations from his hospital bed, felt an unexpected empathy for Junior. Both of them had lived in the shadow of their father's legacies, trying to measure up to expectations they didn't fully understand. The difference was that Devon had found his own connection to that legacy, while Junior had tried to destroy his. Sometimes, Mr. Anderson mused, we spend so much time looking for villains that we miss the wounded people behind the actions. He touched the saved photo album, where pictures showed a younger, happier Maxwell family. Maybe what we need to rebuild isn't just the workshop. The transformation began with a letter written from the psychiatric facility where Junior was receiving treatment. Addressed to both Devon and Mr. Anderson, it revealed a lifetime of complex emotions and unspoken truths. The workshop was never just a building to me, Junior wrote. It was where I lost my father to his dreams of legacy. Every weekend he'd take me there, trying to teach me the poetry he saw in wood grain, the music he heard in sawing and sanding. But all I could hear was disappointment in his voice. All I could see was how I failed to measure up. The letter continued, detailing years of brewing resentment of corporate success that never earned the same pride his father showed in a well-crafted joint or perfectly smooth finish. I thought if I could just erase the workshop, I could erase that feeling of never being enough. I never meant for it to go this far. Catherine brought the letter to Devon's hospital room, where his recovery was progressing slowly but steadily. The doctors had begun allowing him short walks, though his lungs still protested at any exertion. As she read her brother's words aloud, James S.R. sat quietly in the corner, tears rolling down his weathered cheeks. I failed him, the elder Maxwell whispered. I was so busy trying to build something lasting that I didn't see I was losing something precious. His hands, once sure in business deals and woodworking alike, trembled as he reached for the letter. The revelation sparked a deeper conversation about legacy, about the weight of expectations, and about the different ways love can be expressed and understood. Mr. Anderson shared stories of his own son, Michael, and the pressure he'd felt to follow in his father's footsteps before finding his own path, one that ultimately led to sacrifice in service of others. Devon, listening to these interwoven histories of fathers and sons, began to see his own path more clearly. Maybe, he suggested, we've been thinking about legacy all wrong. Maybe it's not about preserving the past exactly as it was, but about taking its best parts into the future. The idea took root. As Devon recovered and Junior continued his therapy, Catherine worked with her father to reshape Maxwell Development's approach. The new vision combined Junior's business acumen with their father's community-focused values. The historic district wouldn't be demolished, it would be revitalized with the workshop site as its heart. Not just a workshop, Devon explained during a planning session from his hospital bed, sketching on a tablet. A learning center, a place where traditional crafts meet modern needs, where business students can learn about sustainable development, and craftsmen can teach the value of working with your hands. The concept resonated with everyone. James S.R., saw in it the fulfillment of his original dream. Catherine recognized its business potential in an era increasingly hungry for authenticity and connection. Even Junior, participating via video calls from treatment, began offering insights about marketing traditional crafts in a modern economy. Mr. Anderson watched these developments with growing hope. "Your father would be proud," he told Devon one evening, "not just of saving the workshop's legacy, but of finding a way to help it grow into something new." The transformation wasn't just in plans and papers. As Devon grew stronger, the community's support evolved from crisis response to active participation in shaping the future. Mrs. Chin organized workshops on business planning for craftsmen. Lisa developed social media strategies for traditional artists. Officer Brady helped create security protocols that protected without intimidating. But perhaps the most profound transformation was in the relationships between fathers and sons, between past and future, between tradition and progress. Junior's breakdown had cracked open doors that had been sealed for decades, allowing for new understandings and unexpected healing. "We're not just rebuilding a workshop," Devon realized. "We're rebuilding connections. Between generations, between craftsmanship and commerce, between people who thought they had to choose between preserving the past and embracing the future." The truth that emerged from the ashes wasn't just about corporate corruption or family dysfunction. It was about the possibility of redemption, about finding ways to honor legacy while creating something new, about healing wounds that had festered across generations. 1 year after the fire, the Anderson Williams Center for Craftsmanship and Community Development opened its doors. The building, rising from the workshop's ashes, honored traditional design while embracing modern sustainability. Solar panels gleamed above timber-framed workshops, and large windows filled the space with natural light. Devon, now returned from his first semester at Stanford's architectural program, stood beside Mr. Anderson at the ribbon-cutting ceremony. His studies had taken on new purpose, combining traditional craftsmanship with sustainable design principles. The smoke damage to his lungs had healed, leaving only occasional reminders of that terrifying night. Today, Devon addressed the gathered crowd. "We're not just opening a building. We're opening a door to a future that remembers its past." Behind him, the center's main hall displayed photographs of both his father and Mr. Anderson's son, their legacies now intertwined in the building's very foundation. James Maxwell Sr. and Junior attended together, their relationship slowly mending through shared involvement in the center's development. Junior, still working through his therapy, had found unexpected peace in learning woodworking properly, this time without the pressure of expectations. His business expertise had proven invaluable in creating a sustainable model for the center's operations. The center itself represented a new vision of community development. The ground floor housed traditional workshops where master craftsmen taught their skills to new generations. The second floor contained modern design studios equipped with both digital tools and traditional workbenches. The top floor offered affordable spaces for artisans starting their own businesses. Catherine's influence ensured the center's financial stability through an innovative partnership between Maxwell Development and various arts organizations. "This is what sustainable development looks like," she explained to visiting business leaders. "We're not just preserving buildings, we're preserving knowledge, skills, and community connections." Mrs. Chin's grocery store had evolved into a marketplace for local artisans, while Lisa's social media expertise helped craftsmen reach global markets. Even Mrs. Whitaker had found a role, teaching traditional quilting techniques to a surprisingly eager young audience. The center's first major project was crafting furniture for a new community center in the historic district. Devon and Mr. Anderson worked side by side, teaching a new generation the skills that had been passed down through centuries. Each piece bore two marks: Mr. Anderson's traditional oak leaf and a phoenix rising from flames, Devon's own signature. "Your father would have loved this," Sarah Williams told her son, watching him guide a young apprentice's hands through a complex joinery technique. The pride in her voice echoed the same tone Marcus had used when teaching Devon in their basement workshop years ago. Officer Brady, now heading community relations for the precinct, brought police cadets to the center regularly. "Understanding the community you serve means understanding what it values," he explained. "This place represents the heart of that understanding." The center became more than just a building, it became a model for responsible development nationwide. Other cities sent representatives to study how traditional crafts could coexist with modern progress, how development could strengthen rather than destroy community bonds. Mr. Anderson's original workshop tools occupied a place of honor in the main hall, alongside photographs documenting decades of craftsmanship. But they weren't merely display pieces. Each tool still saw regular use, teaching new hands the wisdom of old ways. The most powerful moment came when Junior completed his first major piece, a rocking chair that combined traditional techniques with contemporary design. His father's tears weren't of disappointment this time, but of joy at seeing his son finally find his own way to connect with their shared legacy. Devon's architectural studies took on new meaning as he developed ways to integrate traditional craftsmanship into modern construction. His professors were intrigued by his vision of buildings that didn't just house people but helped sustain communities and preserve skills. This, Mr. Anderson said quietly during a quiet moment in the new workshop. This is what we were really saving that night, not just a building or a business, but a way of seeing the world, of understanding what matters. The center stood as testament to the possibility of bridging divides between generations, between progress and tradition, between profit and purpose. It proved that the most valuable legacies aren't just preserved, they're allowed to grow and evolve while keeping their essential truth intact. 5 years after the center's opening, its impact rippled far beyond Oak Street. The Anderson-Williams Center had become a blueprint for community-centered development across the country. Developers and city planners regularly visited to study how traditional craftsmanship could coexist with modern progress. Devon, now graduating with his master's in sustainable architecture, had developed an innovative design philosophy that merged traditional crafting techniques with cutting-edge environmental principles. His thesis project, a network of community workshops integrated into urban development, earned national recognition and sparked a movement toward craft-centered communities. Mr. Anderson, though officially retired, remained the heart of the center. His morning routine included mentoring young craftsmen, his weathered hands still steady enough to demonstrate the finest details of joinery. Each piece we create, he often said, carries the stories of everyone who taught us and everyone will teach. James Maxwell, S.R., and Junior had found a new kind of father-son relationship through their shared commitment to the center. Junior's business acumen, tempered by hard-learned wisdom, helped transform the center into a self-sustaining enterprise that supported both traditional crafts and innovation. His own son, born during the center's 3rd year, spent his earliest days surrounded by the sounds of sawing and sanding, creating a new generation of memories. Catherine's vision expanded beyond Oak Street. She established a foundation that helped similar centers spring up in other communities threatened by soulless development. We're not just preserving buildings, she would explain at conferences. We're preserving the knowledge that builds communities. The center became known for its legacy program, where master craftsmen worked alongside troubled youth, teaching more than just woodworking. Many young people found purpose and direction through the program, including some who had initially been skeptical of its value. Their success stories became powerful testimonials to the healing power of craftsmanship. Sarah Williams found her own role at the center, managing a scholarship program named in honor of her late husband. The Marcus Williams Memorial Fund helped talented young craftspeople pursue their dreams, ensuring that financial constraints wouldn't prevent another generation from carrying forward traditional skills. Lisa's documentation of the center's journey had grown into a popular series about craft and community. Her videos, showing the human stories behind each piece created at the center, helped people understand the value of handmade things in an increasingly mass-produced world. The neighborhood itself had transformed. Instead of luxury condos, the historic district now hosted a vibrant mix of workshops, galleries, and affordable housing. Mrs. Chen's Marketplace became a destination for people seeking authentic, locally crafted goods. Even Mrs. Whitaker's quilting classes had a waiting list. On quiet evenings, Devon would sometimes find himself in the center's main workshop, running his hands over tools that had shaped both wood and lives for generations. His father's old tool belt, still bearing scorch marks from the fire, hung beside Mr. Anderson's first set of chisel symbols of the legacies that had converged to create something new. We didn't just save a workshop, Devon reflected during the center's 5th anniversary celebration. We saved an idea that some things are worth more than profit margins. That true progress doesn't mean forgetting where we came from. that the strongest communities are built by hands that remember the past while shaping the future. The center stood as living proof that development didn't have to mean destruction, that tradition could inspire innovation rather than hinder it, and that the most valuable legacies are those that grow and adapt while keeping their essential truth intact. As Mr. Anderson watched a new generation of craftsmen take their first careful measurements and make their first tentative cuts, he understood that they had built something far more lasting than any single piece of furniture. They had built a bridge between past and future, between craft and commerce, between different generations and cultures. "Your father would be proud," he told Devon one evening as they locked up the workshop together. "Not just of what we saved, but of what we helped grow." Devon nodded, understanding that the true legacy of Anderson's workshop wasn't in the building that had burned, or even in the center that had risen from its ashes. It was in the connections forged, the skills passed down, and the community that had come together to prove that some things, craftsmanship, integrity, and the bonds between people, were truly fireproof. That's the end of our first chapter, but Devon and Mr. Anderson's story has touched so many hearts. If you felt moved by their journey of courage, craftsmanship, and community, please hit that subscribe button to support our storytelling team. Share this story with friends and family who appreciate tales of genuine human connection. Don't forget to like and let us know in the comments what touched you most. Which character resonated with you? Should we continue their story? What do you think happens next in the Anderson Williams Center? Your engagement helps us create more meaningful content. Together, let's keep these heartwarming stories alive.